Welcome to episode 24 of the Creative Train podcast. I was going back through my list of topics that I wanted to cover based on real life experiences that I have had in my 30-something years working as an artist, musician, glass artist, recording engineer. And I touched on this kind of in one episode about toxicity in relationships, but this one is a little bit different. This was about maturity in a creative relationship. The how, why, who, when, and where do we open ourselves up to other artists and creators? It can be a pretty slippery slope. As I alluded to in the intro, it's tough to gauge the levels of things like commitment and motivation, integrity, and, yes, maturity in a group that you've either assembled around yourself or have found yourself in. It's hard to tell these things until you have to face it head on. Too often, these revelations are a result of some kind of conflict where you notice someone is maybe not pulling their weight, or they're complaining about others in the group, or they're making a point of getting in the way of progress by interjecting negativity and a vibe of general adversarial dickishness. When you assemble a group for any task, let's say you're putting together a band, you can rely on friends to recommend trusted players or associates who they've worked with and find them trustworthy, and you can also count on them to tell you people you should steer away from. And generally, once assembled or together, these folks will come together and pull off some, motivational speeches or whatever, and they come across as being super eager to get this new project off the ground. Someone's reputation will often precede them. Perhaps you've heard others talk about this person or that person and the things they do, or you see them coming up on various social media friend/follow suggestions. You know those ones. And you end up connecting, and perhaps a working relationship takes root and blossoms. And in other situations, you might find yourself willing to set aside certain red flags about personality or work ethic in order to hopefully put together something that nobody saw coming. In my 30-some years working as a professional musician, I've seen this many, many, many times in my own experience. And I've learned to not go any further into the project once coming to know exactly who is involved, if I even suspect one of these flags might be waved in front of the group. And what follows is the story of such a thing from my own experience, lived once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and now finally ingrained and learned. Because we're usually pretty astute to sense out other people. We may determine that a working relationship is or isn't likely to work out, and both parties do each other a huge favor if they acknowledge that and don't try to force a relationship merely based on having somewhat shared interests and marginally met motivations. But when the potential of another person's talent and skills shines a light of promise, however bright or dim, upon your situation, it's so very tempting to grab that bait and make for the deep end of the lake with it. You should approach every possible joining with an attitude of eagerness, tempered with caution and concern for the final product, because your names will all be eventually associated with that product. Having said that, unless you really need someone to help you do something that you just can't do, never try to force a relationship, especially in a situation where money and your professional reputation are involved. Creative folks, artists in general, can often be bursting at the seams with ego. And in this definition, I'm using the word ego as meaning filled with false or self-created ideas about the quality of your work and your abilities. And on the other side of that coin are the artists and creators who are crippled by self-doubt and imposter syndrome. The Buddhist interpretation of ego is one thing, and the modern artists' representation of ego is another thing altogether. But for the sake of the podcast today, let us understand that in this scenario, the artist's ego refers to a state of mind or self-aggrandizement and appreciation of one's creative ability based upon established lines of quality, consistency, and reliably unique expression in artistic output. In simpler terms, don't lie about what you have done or what you can do. So back to putting together a band. Many artists have a difficult time talking about themselves and their art, and some others you just can't shut them up. I released an album during the COVID lockdowns. Some tracks were already composed, but not yet recorded, and some were completely new from concept to the final master. In all, 11 tracks were recorded, mixed, mastered, and eventually released during a 5-month span. I felt the time pressure as the lockdowns were supposed to just flatten the curve for 2 weeks, or so they said. So I worked very long and dedicated hours since my teaching studio and schedule was mandated to be shut down, and I had no means of making a living anymore aside from a few students who carried on with online sessions. During this whole process, the most difficult part for me was writing the liner notes. In other words, trying to talk about myself and my songs. Eventually I did it, but I felt almost dirty after having done it, as I tried to find some positivity and somewhat glowing terms to speak about my creations in, and not talk about the mistakes that I could still hear, or the situation we found ourselves in with suddenly so much time on our hands. And then there are those who simply cannot be silenced when it comes to talking about their art or themselves as artists. Somewhere in the middle is the artist who, although highly creative or interpretive, simply hasn't had the experience to function properly with those who have more experience, despite their eagerness, their drive, or their initial best foot forward expression. They have not been around the proverbial block. So they don't understand how creative group dynamics actually work and need to work in the real world. They don't understand how to set aside their ego for the good of the collective, and they inevitably create a barrier between themselves and the folks they are supposed to be in alignment with. Does that sound familiar? I think many of us have been there, if not in a creative venture, then at least in some sort of office or workspace scenario. In my particular situation, I felt the disconnect happen at one point when a band member burst out at rehearsal saying, "Why am I even here if you guys are just figuring out arrangements?" At this point, I knew the person saw themselves as not part of this group. They were someone who was being inconvenienced by being part of something they did not understand that they were an integral part of the decision-making process in. And they chose to sit by with arms tightly folded and pout until their particular moment to shine came up. Later on, we discovered that their mental absence in this process led to a very obvious breakdown of communication during a performance in which they totally missed their cue and ended up sending the band into a live loop of the section until they realized what they had done and they were ready to take the next available cue. Of course, there was some excuse delivered about how the band lost count and failed to hold the song together. So in this case, the far less experienced member, who although is extremely talented, totally checked out in rehearsal and in performance figured they could rely upon their own self-perception of how awesome they are and just ride the vibe of a group of players with decades more experience and collect all the accolades at the end of the night. They ended up failing the group as a whole and ultimately embarrassed themselves and the group during a live performance in which paying audience members got to see the band flounder, though ultimately recover, but flounder nonetheless. After a break in the performance schedule due to holidays and, other family-related events, the band found itself at somewhat of a precarious point, as this aforementioned member decided the rest of us were, quote, too much to deal with, and cast us off as a whole. What will become of this person and their musical career is yet to be seen. Well, I can't honestly call it their career, as they were still extremely new to music performance, and despite their talent, they have at least another decade of serious work ahead of them before anyone will actually take them seriously, if this is going to be that continued attitude to group dynamics. In my mind, I have put them in the column of very good or able hobbyist, not professional. So what do you do when you encounter someone with an ego the size of Pluto? This is another topic I dealt with in episode 13 with the rules of engagement in dealing with other creators and artists. Check it out for a more detailed discussion. But where do we draw the line between wanting to work with others and allowing ourselves to become potential victims to other people's bullshit, and actually wanting to just create good art, to create from our deepest heartfelt intentions? Do we welcome others into our creative hives for companionship and a sense of community, or for collaboration? It's a very slippery slope we tread here. Ask yourself, do I need someone else? Do I want someone else? And if you don't, carry on. But if you do find yourself needing or wanting someone else to be a part of your creative journey and process, maybe to share the rent on shared studio space or something like that, I will offer you this one huge caveat to carry before you, and that is always sense out and trust the vibe. I've mentioned vibe factor in almost every podcast episode and in somewhat lighter contexts. But when it comes to opening yourself, your process, your wellspring of inspiration, and maybe even your studio and supplies up to others, always trust and never doubt the vibe. Despite the short-term benefits, the long-term satisfaction and peace with your creativity is never worth the sacrifice of allowing someone with a sketchy vibe in. There's your pep talk. Now go get to work. Now, I'm not being dismissive. I'm not being excluding. I'm just saying that what we need to understand is that there is a process to mastering our art and our creativity. And we have to understand and acknowledge where we are in that process. And the aforementioned person who was, very talented, but kind of given to lying about their experience, they really let it show. And before you open up your studio space, your creative space, your vibe, your sacred space, just be really, really careful about who you let into it, because the lingering effects can last a long time, and you don't need that